Welcome back to my Raven's Tale video series, where I talk about all the underdiscussed links between psychology, self-healing, and imaginal narratives. So, why is it important to distinguish between fantasy and imagination? When you think of these two words, it's easy to see why you might say, well, aren't these just the same thing? And in colloquial usage, yeah, they kind of are. Fantasy can refer to stories, genres of storytelling, daydreaming, or whatever. Imagination, of course, is often used to mean those same things too. But in analytical psychology, they have two very different meanings. And this difference has become very important in recent neuroscience literature as well. Now, I love fantasy stories, that's no secret. But genre is a different usage of that particular word, fantasy, than what I'm talking about here. For this video, I'm getting into the important technical difference between fantasy and imagination that we speak of in analytical psychology. So, what's the difference? If you're talking about the inner experience of things which are not there in the real world, there are two basic sources for them. On one hand, one source is fantasy, which refers to essentially consciously willed imagery and narratives. This would be things like daydream, an anticipated situation, a deliberately recalled memory, or maybe even a future plan. On the other hand, imagination refers to imagery that emerges suddenly into our awareness without any will on the part of the conscious ego. Dreams, suddenly recalled images, things that feel like they're out of the blue or what have you. This distinction is critical for not only creative work, but also for therapeutic work. You may not know this, but you have a hidden and limitless fountain of creative power within you. That's the imagination. Did you know? It's true. But it's not fantasy, it's imagination. Engaging with it without getting lost in fantasy is tricky, but once you learn how to do it, you unlock a powerful tool that you can use to help with self-development and growth, as well as supercharging any creative works that you're trying to do. Because here's the secret, they're both the same thing. That is, the creative works and self-development is both a creative act. More recently, this distinction has been made by researchers in spontaneous thought, which includes neuroscientists, but also philosophers, artists, and other creatives who have found the distinction extremely useful. But of course, this distinction between these two kinds of inner imagery goes very far back. It goes back thousands of years. Tantric meditation, I believe, has this distinction in place. I'm not an expert on Tantric, but any of you out there who are familiar with this, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that that is one element of this ancient tradition. In the West, this distinction goes far back, at least as the Hermetic tradition, and I strongly suspect, for reasons too complex to get into here, that it was part of a much older tradition in the Celto-Germanic peoples of the Iron Age, such as Druids or skalds of Norse poetry and more ancient traditions of mantic practice. Throughout the medieval period, of course, you have the alchemists, and they discuss this very same distinction. Characters like Paracelsus, Thomas Vaughan, Agrippa, all of these guys make a big deal about how useless fantasy is compared with the imagination. They often equate fantasy with illusion and sterile, dead-end paths of practice. But why? Well, it was felt that if you could consciously engage with imagination rather than simply getting lost in ego-driven fantasy, then you would be able to accomplish psycho-spiritual perfection through rigorous practice. The ultimate goal of the alchemists, for example, particularly the spiritual ones, was to achieve a perfect union between the body and the divine. The philosopher's stone for these mystics was a metaphor for this union, through which one could achieve ecstatic union with the cosmos. In analytical psychology, Jung developed a modern psychological version of this practice, and he drew from the alchemists when he was developing this. Now, his goal was something a little bit more prosaic, which would be healing neurotic symptoms and achieving greater integration of inner conflicts, although he did still acknowledge these higher purposed practice aims as well, like divine union and all that religious experience, particularly in the second half of life. He called this practice active imagination. Now, there are some out there who criticize this practice and claim that it's all just ego fantasy or scripted Jungian stuff. Pay no attention to these naysayers. Active imagination is a legitimate practice, and it's very effective. It is, however, not very easy to do at first. It requires a lot of practice and a lot of patience, which, unsurprisingly, the ancient alchemists repeat over and over again. So the practice of active imagination is one best undertaken with the help of a knowledgeable practitioner, such as a therapist, a trained coach, a professional. To explain exactly how it works in its entirety would make this video about 9 hours long, so let's just cover the basics. The very first step when you're using this technique, whether for personal development or to spur creativity, is to practice some sort of mindfulness technique, a relaxation, going inward, that kind of thing. And then rather than deliberately push the imagery that you're experiencing willfully, drop this down on purpose and attend to that which spontaneously emerges. Then you have to, once that does happen, not force it. It's not easy to do this, and it does take a lot of practice. And in fact, one of the challenges of the early stages of active imagination is figuring out which of the imagery that popped up in my head is fantasy and which is imagination, because I don't want fantasy, I want imagination. So how do you tell the difference? Well, this takes practice. On a certain level, you're going to have to develop a feel for it, but some starter points, I think, are number one, fantasy is going to tend to be very repetitive. It will come across as somewhat sterile and stale after a while, and it tends to be very ego gratifying. Now, these techniques these criteria were actually developed by Jeffrey Raff in his book Jung and the Alchemical Imagination. Really, really good book. Raff was a student of Marie-Louise von Franz, and of course, Marie-Louise von Franz was one of Jung's closest students and wrote quite a bit of very, very interesting and classic Jungian material. I actually emailed Raff and asked him if he would agree with a couple of other criteria that I have come up with on my own, and that is ways that you can identify truly contents that are truly from the imagination. And what I came up with is that imagination content should be surprising. It should be sometimes not what you want to experience. In other words, it's the opposite of ego gratifying, and it should have this uncanny feeling of weirdness to it. It will be unexpected very commonly. When I added these and I suggested those to him, he said, yes, those are very good additions to that. He also mentioned that patience and persistence is very critical in this practice. Anyway, when you draw from fantasy in your own meditative practice, self-development, or creative work, you won't get anywhere. You'll just wind up circling around your own complexes and not drawing from anything truly creative. If, however, you learn how to engage seriously with your imagination, that's when the real work begins and the truly inspirational content will come from that endless source of creative energy that we all have. Catch you next time.